Hello, everyone. So I'm Luisa Cardani. I head the data center program at techUK. I have to say, this is the first non-data center specific sector event where I've heard so much talk about data centers, so that's great. So I think talking about resilience and climate change adaptation in particular is something that is very important, not just for the sector that I look after at techUK, but for all of the tech sector. And it's, we can all agree by now that regardless of the 1.5 degree warming of the planet, extreme weather will become more and more prominent and will need to adapt to climate change. That said, as you well know, COP28 will focus a lot on adaptation and helping countries with loss and damage. And there is a lot that is happening in the space. I have here three fantastic panelists who all have very different perspectives within climate change resilience for the tech sector. Worth mentioning that when it comes to resilience, it's not just physical, but there is an angle where the tech sector not just needs to become itself more adaptable and resilient, but it also plays a great role in helping other sectors plan better for climate change. So without further ado, we have George Baldwin, from the head of climate resilience and strategy at Marsh, and Natalie Forrestill, senior cybersecurity consultant sustainability at AtkinsRéalis, and I will mispronounce this, apologies, Isabelle de Brancion, yes, business and innovation lead for Geovation. So perhaps you could give us a bit of an intro about yourselves and your own take on the topic.
And this is where I find out if the mic works.
Yes,
I think it does.
It does.
We're in. Pleasure to see you all today. Thank you so much for letting me be part of this. So one word on me and my team. George Baldwin, I run what we grandly call our climate resilience and strategy team in Marsh advisory. That's about 25 people made up of climate scientists and management consultants, hence the AND strategy, because virtually all of the issues that come out of climate, be it adaptation, resilience, how do we make our business model work in a different future, they're strategy questions in disguise. Now, what that question means to me principally is where we have talked a lot about the opportunities for the tech sector to play a meaningful role in decarbonisation, the elephant in the room is that the physical world is going to change around us. The climate change between now and 2050 is baked into pretty much all the models. It's the second half of the century that gets affected by whether we get our act together on decarbonisation. Now, somewhat disappointingly, we've seen a good few companies who have reported on climate change in their annual reports kind of sweep the adaptation bit under the carpet because they don't want to be misperceived as giving up on the decarbonisation aspect. So what I'm hoping to do in this session and discussion with you guys is bring some of that good work to light.
Natalie?
Great, thanks very much. So yes, hi, I'm Natalie. I work in the cyber resilience arm within AtkinsRéalis. So what does this mean in terms of sustainability? So about just over a year ago, I founded an internal initiative to look at and understand the relationship between cybersecurity and cyber resilience with sustainability. What are the risks here? What are the opportunities? What are the joint wins? And just the general relationship and dynamics between that. We've spoken a lot today about systems resilience, and cybersecurity really does come into that, and sort of more than people generally expect it to. The general resilience of technical systems plays into the sort of cyber resilience agenda, and that's hopefully something I'll be able to talk about today.
Yes?
Yeah, thanks. And it's working, which is good. So as Luisa said, I'm Isabelle, and I'm a business and innovation lead for Geovation. So Geovation is the innovation hub for Ordnance survey. So you probably all know Ordnance survey for the paper maps, but we're actually way more than just paper maps. We have over 500 million of features in our database, and through our 230 surveyors and 2 planes flying across the UK, we actually update more than 20,000 daily features. So we are a very kind of credible and authoritative source of data and physical data, and that's where we actually come into place. So leveraging about 200 years of location data, Ordnance Survey has created Geovation, which is really about enabling and helping startups and innovators use location data to create innovations. And we do help a lot of startups working on climate and using our data and other data sources.
That's fantastic, really interesting. So I guess the first question is really to each of you, because you all bring a very different perspective to the table. How can firms embed climate risk exposure into their plans? Whoever wants to start. Who's feeling brave, exactly.
I'm happy to start. So how does cyber resilience play into this? So a lot of organizations currently are investing a lot of money in cybersecurity programs, because for a long time cybersecurity was treated as a bolt-on, and they're now having to go through and embed this across the organization. This is a similar challenge that we have within the sustainability sort of challenge. But sort of specifically, there's a couple of opportunities here. We've spoken today about asset management. So you need to understand your assets in order to understand the sort of climate risk and the sort of risk that's embedded here. So there's a joint opportunity there to sort of use these two challenges within your organization and tackle them together. Same thing for supply chain management. That's something we've spoken about a lot here. For cybersecurity, you need to understand your supply chain and maybe working together with these different teams and that whole sort of systems thinking approach. You can sort of tackle that problem together, and also in terms of value for money, that also makes a huge benefit here, and that's sort of a big part of the conversation. But I just briefly wanted to touch on as well around the physical resilience when it comes to business continuity and disaster recovery. This is a big sort of part of cyber resilience, but when you think about climate change, changing temperatures, storms and floods, we work a lot with critical national infrastructure organisations. They have sort of very large disparate networks across the UK, often in isolated parts, where with changing temperatures, for instance, increased maintenance cycles, needing to replace more pieces of sort of tech on maybe a site in the middle of nowhere up in Scotland that needs to be accessed frequently. This is increased cost. Maybe a flood or a storm could sort of bring down sort of a rail line, or maybe take out a substation, and then that entire customer base doesn't have power. This is something you have to think about in terms of your planning, and this is both a cyber resilience challenge but also a sustainability challenge. So you need to have that sort of holistic systems thinking in that risk planning for the long term as well, to think about how these things need to be planned for and mitigated against.
And building on what you're saying, to be able to do all these things, you need to have reliable data, you need to have accurate data, and you need to have transparency as well. So all these, the assets and any physical asset, for any company to be able to work and plan for its resilience, you need to have the appropriate data. And that's why it's absolutely key to be able to track, plan, and prevent using the data.
Absolutely. George?
And perhaps to bring Isabelle's example to life a little bit more, we've worked with a number of banks over the years who were at the forefront of having to stress test and report on what climate change means for them, courtesy of the big stick of regulation that comes from central banks. And the answers, or the readiness to answer that, varied hugely by geography. We've worked from Asia through to the US and a goodly amount in Europe, as you'd imagine. And to bring your one to life in particular, Isabelle, the work that we managed to do in the UK, backed, I suspect, underneath it all by decent Ordnance survey data, was relatively straightforward. The hardest bit was trying to figure out who in the bank even owned the theme of climate change, and it turned out to be 50 different people all at once in lockstep. Yeah, the cheer for that, you understand the pain. But in an Irish context, I don't know if you're aware of this, it's possible to have an entire village that has the same address. Every single house has the same address, and the only person that knows which is which, the people that live there, and the postman. And as a result, your ability to then layer onto that meaningful climate data, which is the lifeblood of these sorts of activities, is incredibly constrained. So when we say that the tech sector has a lot to add here, just parsing information that has been in people's heads for the last 50 years gets you to the start line for these sorts of actions. And Natalie, you raised a very good point towards the end of your piece on physical resilience. I will not accuse anyone in here of being as backward thinking as perhaps some sectors that have been around since the dawn of time. But the answers we very often get are, well, physical resilience is insurance's problem. And that is true right up until you can't get it. And then you realize that what you actually need to do is adapt your business processes and your engineering and hardware for your own assets in order to be both risk resilient in the future, but as a second order effect, remain insurable and therefore not breach covenant if you're raising debt against those particular assets. Now, all of that sounds like a massive headache. If there is one saving grace, it's that if you are undertaking these exercises in earnest to understand your physical risk, there is a window of adaptation. Maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, depending on what you've got, where you've got it. And you probably, to your Scottish infrastructure point, need to do some things now, but a lot of it can be road mapped in for the decade ahead. So try to understand the suite of interventions you can make, the timing with which you need to make them, and what the life cycle of those existing assets is in the first place can make the life and death difference between whether the adaptation you need to do is a massive financial headache or business as usual if you plan it right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think I definitely know the example that you were referring to in Scotland. But Natalie, what specific risks are there therefore for tech firms and infrastructure providers? Can you give us some more detailed examples?
Yeah, so I guess for this particular question, I'm thinking specifically about sort of net zero technology. So there's a real push for us, obviously very much warranted, in order to decarbonize some of our most carbon-intensive sectors. This is sort of through renewable energy adoption, adopting different tools, data analysis, and also general behavior change. And sort of looking specifically at these sort of dedicated technologies, especially when looking to decarbonize C&I, we might be bringing so IoT devices essentially, so Internet of Things, into environments which are very much operational technology heavy, and these systems are generally a lot older, weren't even designed to be connected to the internet at any point. So by bringing in these IoT devices, we are increasing the sort of threat surface essentially and potential risk of attack. This is obviously not what we want to do when you think about the Ukraine power grid attack a few years ago, as well as the Colonial Pipeline attack more recently, which was, I believe, the largest attack on C&I in the US. We obviously don't want that. So we need to be really careful about how we integrate these technologies. And with this ties into around how C&I is viewed. So we have this thing called the NIS regulations, so Security of Networks and Information Systems, and this applies to operators of essential services. These are very large operators of essential services with a huge customer base. These particular cybersecurity regulations don't really apply to renewables because they currently just don't supply enough customers in order to be subject to them. And while this is the case now, this won't be in the future. Hopefully very soon they will be supplying sufficient customers, and that will mean that they'll have to apply to these regulations. This brings with it a risk that cybersecurity will be treated as a bolt-on in the future, which then needs to go back and be retrofitted, and a lot of money spent in order to bring this in line. So we really need to make sure that cybersecurity is embedded into these systems right now.
That's great. Yeah, no, absolutely. I had no idea about that. That's fascinating. Something to be mindful of. Isabelle, I guess the other side of this is, the role that tech can play in innovation. So, what interesting innovations are you seeing that are happening in the modeling, forecasting, and mapping world to help with some of these climate change risks?
So the good news is there's a lot of innovation happening. First, there's a lot of money happening in innovation in the climate tech world. The global enterprise value for climate tech startups is about $2.6 trillion, so it's quite a notable number. Although it's kind of gone down slightly, it's still quite relevant. And the climate tech has mainly benefited from obviously computer power and better, ability to do machine learning and AI, but also from satellite data and a plethora of satellite data and the capability that satellite data is bringing. So it's another layer of data that can be added. So in terms of, there are lots of ways to look at innovation in that field. But if you look at prevention, for example, we have one of our startups that just finished our program, well, actually finished a few years ago. The program is looking at, has built a platform, a geospatial platform to de-risk infrastructure in construction. So, for example, one of the projects they worked on is this gigantic sewer that is happening at the end of Thames to avoid sewage overflow in the Thames. And it's about 25 kilometers long, 41 meters deep. So you can imagine building that is actually quite a complicated task. And the risk on that is obviously flooding, episodes of flooding. You need to make sure that the team working underground are safe from flooding, but still you need to try and make sure that you're going as fast as possible. So this company has developed, putting sensors in, using our data, obviously, OS data, BGS, so British Geological Survey's data, other environmental data, and their own sensors, and satellite data. And their predictive modeling algorithm, they've managed to be very, very accurate in predicting the risk of flood and therefore minimizing the amount of hours not worked, yet making sure that people working were protected and safe. So that's a really interesting way to look at combining different data sets and making sure that you achieve the right thing. And on another side, for example, OS has developed a platform, a global platform, which is it's actually in progress, which is a supply chain data partnership platform. So it's really about working together to understand where the assets are and understanding how you can monitor and be transparent and avoid greenwashing on where assets are in the world, and therefore be able to track that. And the last innovation I would talk about, which is another OS innovation. There's some quite... No, it's fine.
Technical difficulties over here.
So the other interesting innovation that we've worked on is about, again, it's about monitoring and restoring. So it's about restoration and carbon offset. So working with Natural England in a degraded peatland near Doncaster, there was approximately, imagine, over 1,000 football pitches of peatland, and they are degraded. The issue is Natural England wants to make sure that they are going to be repaired. Obviously, you all know how much peatland is important for carbon offset. So what we've done with a combination of data sets, again, of satellite imagery, of aircraft imagery, drone imagery, and ground data, so people literally on the ground, the combination of data has allowed us to create a platform that would be a unique and central point for investors, for Natural England, so landowners, and the restoration party as well, so people working on the restoration of the land, to look and verify and understand, monitor how the peatland is being restored. And therefore, it's about creating that transparency and that central point and making sure that there's no possibility to greenwash and sell off carbon without a carbon credit that are not real.
That's absolutely fascinating. I learn something new every day. For example, the sector I take care of at techUK data centers, we voluntarily report within the DEFRA ARP framework. So, how the sector is progressing, how they're planning for climate change. George, from your perspective, how can firms plan for future climate risks?
Very good. I'll introduce a new framework. Everyone loves a new framework at the end of a long working day. We had the pleasure of working with the UN on a piece of work called the Principles of Resilient Infrastructure, and they started that work perhaps 2 years ago, not particularly with climate as the sole focus, and certainly not, as the name suggests, with the broader economy in mind. But what they actually came up with was something that we find to be very applicable for any forward-thinking institution. Clearly the paradigm is around, for example, sewage and water treatment, energy, all the core infrastructure you would think, and they had particular emphasis on emerging markets. But it boils down to thinking of all of the stakeholders that are in the ecosystem of, in this case, infrastructure, in your case, your organization, and drawing that as broadly as possible. So we're used to thinking of our suppliers, our organization, our customers. This brings that paradigm more into the context of the community, into nature. So if you are operating in critical national infrastructure, understanding the people that rely on it at the end of the value chain, how much do they understand of what you are providing, and therefore how much can they, in their day-to-day activities, encourage and support you to maintain the uptime of this critical infrastructure, rather than it being a vague and ephemeral thing that provides you with whatever important utility lets you go about your day. Similarly, we cannot talk about the broader climate agenda without talking about nature as a stakeholder. I think that's very clear from your last example, Isabelle. So bringing that into both the design of new infrastructure and potentially into existing business models, we found to be very powerful in combination with the very simple and lightweight exercises that are mandated by the likes of TCFD, and which I'm sure many of the organizations in this room, whether voluntarily, as Luisa said about ARP, or not, have found themselves undertaking. So with those two lenses, we typically find that what that does is push to the fore the issues that need to be most critically dealt with by the client organizations today. And those can be as simple as road mapping the changes that you need to see in the physical world in order to maintain your uptime. But it might also be making some really tough decisions about where your organization sits in and amongst its stakeholders. There is a trade-off between what you're able to promise your investors, what you're able to promise your customers, and what your reputation might be in the market. I know we're kind of saying don't say data centers, but do you know, I was talking to a data center provider the other day, and as you inevitably will when you give me bait like that, and they had a genuine existential dilemma of, they believe they have priority contracts with their electricity suppliers so they can maintain high SLAs, but when push comes to shove, do they really want to turn off the village that's just down the branch line from where their rural data center is in order to then be able to maintain customer demand? Now, when you start thinking through that as a holistic issue, what you mean is more redundancy in your own operation is necessary, because you need to be in a position where you can turn off individual pieces of infrastructure. And the same is kind of true of mobile networks and many other tech firms where there are these branch lines into exposed locations. Now, if we use a slightly different paradigm, the same is true of supply chains, which has come up time and time again. It is true from a cyber risk perspective. It's certainly true from a political risk and climate perspective, and all three are interwoven. So what we've found working with clients with complex supply chains in the tech sector are, one, absolutely understand who their direct suppliers are. Two, have a vague idea who's supplying them. Three, it's somewhere in the Far East, and that's kind of where the amount of information dies. So we've tried to work with clients that want to understand this better, and it can be done. There are examples in this sector and no other where they understand all the way back to base minerals where the materials come from. But for most, it's that level of obscurity and moving out into the fog. And you very quickly find interesting stressors that you don't realize are more important than perhaps your own physical assets, like one of your critical tier 2 suppliers supplies someone else who's a lot bigger than you are. And a bit like the electricity example, when push comes to shove, who are they going to serve? So these are, as you might imagine, complex analyses to undertake. But in so doing, and back to the theme of having time in which to do these exercises now, that will make for a very different outcome in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, as we all adapt our business models more than anything else.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Do we have time for a couple of questions? Yeah, there we go. So if anyone has a question, please come forward and introduce yourself and let us know who you'd like to ask the question to.
Have we asked for hands? Give everyone a minute.
Oh, a quick one, actually.
There we go.
Just example, you talked about different framework stuff. Is there any international best practice that you kind of can allude to, and maybe, I don't know, Singapore or Korea or Japan, where there's kind of, I don't know, some other places that are extreme risk? Are there any kind of good examples of best practice abroad that could be adopted for the UK?
I'm not sure, this is a slightly different slant on that, but in terms, something we've been looking into is sort of understanding, so there's a thing called 𝗔𝗰𝗁𝗲, which is the cybersecurity framework from the US, and that all brings together this idea of value and risk, and how if you have an asset, you have to protect it because you believe it's delivering value. So you have to protect something that you care about. And I think this thinking can very much be applied to the existing challenge of sustainability and how we achieve this challenge. I think there's certainly some crossovers with some of the cybersecurity frameworks that can be sort of inform some of our decision making when it comes to sustainability, and this is something that we're looking at the moment.
Thank you. One last one. If not, we can actually, one up right behind you, Adam.
Hi there. I work for an asset management company, and we regularly engage with tech companies on both physical risks and cybersecurity. So it's fantastic to have all three of the panelists here. I was wondering if the panelists could share what sort of key expectations you would have for companies with whom you work, maybe just really high level, beyond the obvious interventions, because in cybersecurity we often hear we have, the ISO, NIST certification, physical risk. We've assessed them. We can look at the CDP questionnaire. But what are the maybe non-obvious things that you would look for in the company's strategy beyond those obvious things that maybe an outsider could easily assess? Not sure if I'm phrasing this question correctly, but yeah.
Who would like to take it?
Okay, I'm happy to start. So I'd probably say initially, I'd say communication. So I think a really interesting thing is how organizations manage their risk, because essentially cybersecurity comes down to risk and cyber resilience comes down to risk. So how the risk approach of the organization, how risks are raised, how they are handled, and how as well the board treats them and how they discuss those risks. I think nothing should be treated in isolation, and you should have as much sort of people coming to the table to discuss these risks and how to target them. So hopefully that touches or covers your question. But I'll hand over to my other panelists.
Take a swipe at that. We actually do more work on my team with asset managers, investors, pension funds who are interested in poking around in the climate risks of their portfolio companies than we do with the portfolio companies themselves. So my message to any portfolio company is get on top of that, because people are poking around in your business and there's probably 10 interested parties looking at you versus you just in yourself. For that reason, I'd actually turn it around and perhaps ask back. The larger asset management companies we've worked with, and forgive me, I know nothing of your portfolio, have invested quite a lot in having house views on what they want, how they want to stress their portfolio companies. So it's very self-evident that you want them to come to you and say, we have a net zero roadmap, we have plans for resilience and adaptation, but to what level of global warming, by what time frame, and what level of adaptation do you expect to see in order to maintain your present level of risk or a higher level of risk, but therefore higher return? It's something that we've seen directed top down by the asset management companies more and more, and interested to know if you're on that journey.
Would you like to have a response?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's more poking even deeper beyond even supply chain diversification is where very often things kind of fall apart. That top level view is there, but the deeper you go, the more risks you see, and especially with tech and whether it's data centers or semiconductors, hence the interest.
Any more hands?
Right, then I think we can wrap it up. I think we can all thank our fantastic panelists, Isabelle, George and Natalie, and yes, next panel on AI, correct?